What's the good word, Jets fans? It's your boy DKB here. We're going to dig into another former head coach, current offensive coordinator, and Kliff Kingsbury as part of the potential targets for our head coach search coming up in 2025. And so far, I will say this is probably my least favorite. We've covered Ben Johnson. We covered Mike Vrabel. There's a lot of things that I love about Kliff Kingsbury's background, specifically the fact that he's on the offense. But when you also take a look at him as kind of having this quarterback whisperer stigma about him and the wide variety of quarterbacks that he's worked with, I can get excited about the premise of a guy like Jordan Travis developing behind him if we potentially go the quarterback route in this upcoming draft, depending on how our record plays out as well. But there's a lot to love. From an X's and O's standpoint, Kliff Kingsbury comes from some really, really good stock where he's been a part of some amazing rooms. And I think that's kind of the Kickstarter here for a guy like Kliff, right? 43 years old. His father was a coach, so coming up, he obviously got to work with a lot of the X's and O's. Also a former player, so, plenty of elements here that I love. Him being previously drafted by the Patriots, but then also getting to kind of go on a tour of sorts with the Saints, playing for the Jets, being a part of the Bills, and then he ended up in the NFL Europe League and also played in the CFL before deciding to get into the college ranks officially. So this is a guy that's well-versed, well-traveled, can take inspiration from, plenty of different sources. I have no idea what the Europe Football League looks like, for example, but the CFL college ranks, there's some elements of things that can cause for a exciting offense, right? And I think that's one of the stigmas or the labels with Kliff specifically is that he does have innovative, he has creative, he has exciting offenses that have been able to not only improve upon itself from a scheme standpoint and how they look to manipulate and exploit defenses, but also just the fact that you can't necessarily, and specifically this year, pinpoint what he wants to do on a week in and week out basis, and there's plenty of things that he's taken advantage to. In fact, to me, he is currently what Chip Kelly was supposed to be when he came into the league, and Kliff has just found a way to adapt a lot better without having this Bill Belichickian type mindset that the scheme is effectively more important than the players. Bill always did a great job of bringing in the right kind and quality of players that he wanted for the scheme, so it was always a perfect marriage in a lot of cases. But I think Kliff definitely accentuates things in that standpoint. Now, from a historical perspective, when you want to talk about his background, former offensive coordinator, quarterback coach, also came in as a quality control coach for Texas A&M and then the Houston Cougars. After that, getting that experience, he was able to become the head coach of Texas Tech, where he was a former quarterback of, and also where Patrick Mahomes is. And we'll talk about a little bit of that connection as well. But ended up having a 35-40 record, but each season he ranked in the national top 10 for passing yards and in the top 20 for total offense as a whole, which is pretty hard to do. Even in the college landscape, things can change so quickly, and this is prior to NIL deals and all that. But when you want to talk about Texas Tech isn't up there with the LSUs, the USCs, those high top tier premier teams. I wanted to say BYU, but I think I'm thinking of Penn State, for example. But really those general high, Georgia, those year in and year out, top SEC, Big Ten type teams. So for him to bring the Texas Tech really to national attention is pretty amazing in and of itself. And, on paper, looking at the 35-40 record, I'm not excited, right? I know he was I believe this to be the case anyways, the first coach to ever become a head coach in the NFL after having a losing record in college. He's had a lot of firsts in his career, right? But I think it spoke to a lot of what obviously the Cardinals were expecting with the type of quarterback they plan on drafting in Kyler Murray, but also the innovative version of the air raid offense that he brought in, right? Now, he gets to finishes Texas Tech, goes to the Cardinals as their head coach, finishes that tenure with the 28-37-1 record before he is let go there. So the first thing that screams out to me is, much like with quarterbacks when you're drafting one, or generally any player overall, I like guys that are coming from a winning atmosphere. And I don't want to say culture, because it's hard on an individual level to really change that if you're not the quarterback specifically. But a winning atmosphere is important to me. And so seeing that he's essentially fostered two different losing environments, you have to have question marks here, right? What faltered? Is it his inability to kind of be that CEO style head coach? Is it his inability to connect with the players? Is it his inability to teach concepts, or is he a bad X's and O's guy? There's a lot of questions that can come up if you're Kliff Kingsbury, and the fact that he continues to get these jobs, and not just the fact that he's getting these jobs, but he's getting pretty premier looks, right? Kliff Kingsbury is generally always one of the top names mentioned, I feel like, when a coaching cycle comes up and he either was looking for a promotion or looking for a job. So pretty interesting piece. After the Cardinals and being fired, though, he tried to take a little bit of a hiatus and ended up being the senior offensive assistant for USC, obviously overseeing Caleb Williams in that offense. And then we know him now as the offensive coordinator for the Commanders. So taking a look at his coaching history, his pathway here, I feel like it's more bad than good, but it's one of those situations where after digging a little bit deeper, I think this is one of those guys that every time he's fallen, he's been able to find a way to try to rise to the occasion. It may not have necessarily been in that same environment. For example, couldn't turn things around with the Cardinals with them letting him go, but he turned that into something where he can learn and, bounce some stuff off of Lincoln Riley and helped keep Caleb Williams as a number one prospect while turning himself into a suitable suitor, I guess, for lack of better words, for the Commanders. And Dan Quinn really, pulling the wool over Antonio Pierce's eyes with the Raiders, since he did have a deal locked in to be their offensive coordinator, but they were dragging their feet over the years. To my understanding, Kliff wanted 3, the Raiders only wanted to offer 2, and potentially the dollar amount. Dan Quinn made a very strong, 11th hour move to end up bringing him over, and this looked like it's done wonders. I think the Commanders are sitting at 7-2, right, which is probably their best record in, I want to say I saw since 1953 or something insane like that, which I could fully believe, right? So you take a look at this scheme next, right? And when we get into this, I want to let you guys get kind of a foray into the kind of quarterbacks that he's worked with, right? A lot of these guys he has coached into the primes of their career for that point that he's met them, right? A lot of these guys coming in college, obviously, but even in the NFL with Kyler Murray. Kyler Murray looked like a top quarterback prospect for a pretty good portion of his career prior to things falling off the rails. You can honestly throw in some of the injury history into that as well, and the lack of weapons or lack of ability to develop some of the weapons to help him out. And then, of course, his scheme getting a little bit stale. But honestly, his track record isn't that horrific considering what the actual win-losses say. So Kyler Murray, Caleb Williams, Patrick Mahomes with Texas Tech, Johnny Manziel and Texas A&M, Case Keenum, Davis Webb, and then Nick Shimonek. Last one I'm not too familiar with at all, but these were all guys that he was able to essentially coach up to have their career best at whatever point they were at. And again, a lot of them being in the collegiate environment, but Kyler Murray being in the NFL, who's probably looked at as worse as maybe a slightly below average to maybe slightly above average, somewhere in that realm. So I'd probably say like 12th best quarterback to maybe, like the 18th to maybe 20th worst guy, right? Dual threat ability speaks for itself, and some of the things that we've seen under Kliff's tutelage. But I'm really intrigued by the scheme here, right? So prior to all of his other steps, you can kind of throw him in the Dan Quinn understudy category as of right now, I suppose, which probably helps out. You have a strong defensive mind that you can bounce a lot of these ideas off of, and I think that's why they have such a strong scheme that's working at a pretty strong level right now, and there's still a lot of opportunity for improvements there with the Commanders. But you take a look at that scheme. He's still running a version of his air raid, but it's definitely evolved over the years from his time with the Cardinals all the way up to now. And I think one of the things that speaks volumes is that Kliff has manipulated his scheme based on, one, the quarterback that he's had available to him, and two, just what he can actually get out of some of these guys, right? There's no use in running 3 and 4, wide receiver sets consistently, and you don't have the guys that can get down the field, or you don't have the guys that can create that separation or have certain, yard after catch ability and different things like that. So another guy that, while his packages may not be as layered, may not be as fluid and well built as guys like a Ben Johnson, guys like a Kyle Shanahan out there, you can see him having elements of that where he's able to build in a bootleg off of a play action, off of a bubble screen, off of a West Coast zone run concept or a gap scheme. So looking at his scheme, you'll see things like odd alignments, right, where you want to talk about having 2 tackles on the same side, for example, one playing as a tight end. You'll see the unbalanced offensive line. You'll see the running plays where he's featuring counters. He has sweeps involved. He has dive concepts. You'll have the passing game where he has a lot of plays that really target every wide receiver on the depth chart if they have a way of being on the field. And considering that he's coming from an air raid, he plans on digging into that bag or of having the 5th or 6th wide receiver on his field at certain points due to exhaustion, game plan, physical archetypes, etc. So that gets me excited, right? Especially when you consider some of the talents that we've had at the bottom end of our roster, and you want to see them kind of get shots, but we've been so dead set on running 2 tight end packages or having, just our 11 personnel, and we don't really see other guys outside of injury, and then we end up making a ton of excuses like you're seeing with Malachi Corley right now, whether that's mostly player-based or whether it's just, the coach is being a little bit hard-headed or they just want to outrightly slow-pay things. But still, experience is essentially the best, right? The reps for getting these guys going. So I love that element. Now, part of his air raid system here is that, for guys that don't know, we'll explain the general concept here. You're spreading out the defense. You'll generally run 3 wide receiver sets. You may even have 4, and you want to push the ball down the field. Part of that, at least with him coming from college, was that meant the running game was an afterthought. Very little. You were going to see a ton of things like bubble screens. And when there were running plays, you were pretty much running them a ton out of shotgun, which means not under center, pretty easy signal in a lot of situations to determine, if the ball was going to be ran. And that makes for a easily predictable offense, right? But he's been able to offset that quite a bit. And to be honest, I don't know if it's whether him having offensive coordinators that can balance out his pass-heavy approach, or even in this current day, maybe Dan Quinn, who wants an emphasis on the run game, but he's been able to do well, not only with the Cardinals as well, who pretty much had an efficient, at worst, maybe rushing attack, if not, anything spectacular. Even now with the Commanders, you can see not only Brian Johnson, you can see Austin Eckler having some of their career best performances within this offense. And obviously Jaden Daniels helps and stuff like that. But from an NFL perspective, you're going to still see that shotgun usage, even current day with the Commanders. But a lot of what has really been helping them out is that he plays a up-tempo offense, right? So there's not a lot of huddling. He wants to get into the field. I don't know if that's whether, him just having a fully scripted game plan and he kind of figures when he wants to go off script with it. But the Commanders maybe have one of the most unpredictable offenses in the NFL right now, and one of the things I love is that it hasn't ever looked disorganized. It hasn't really looked like guys have no idea what's going on. So he did a phenomenal job during installation, obviously, but also the comfortability of having a guy like Jaden Daniels, a rookie, being able to run and facilitate this whole ship, where you would expect maybe he needs to have a minute to kind of pause and take his breath and stuff. He's been able to just hit the gas from the get-go and get things going here. So I love that element. Something we probably couldn't run with Aaron Rodgers, but if somehow we picked up Kliff and we still had Aaron Rodgers on the roster, I would expect him to really kind of button down things and figure out a way to utilize Aaron Rodgers mostly out of the pocket. As we've seen right now, there are times where he can still get out and do some damage. The Patriots game was really the biggest demonstration of that, but you've seen him pick it up again a little bit against this victory over the Texans. But between him getting, pile driven into the ground quite a bit, and some of the nicks and bruises he's picked up in terms of lower body injuries, you're not expecting a ton a year later, right, if he decides he wants to keep going. So some of the main principles that I do enjoy here is that you'll see still a lot of gap scheme rushing attacks, something that we were particularly excited about, seeing how the changes, some of the guys that we picked up like John Simpson and Morgan Moses, who have a lot of experience with that coming from the Ravens, and probably something that really would have helped out Breece Hall and specifically a guy like Braylon Allen, with that being some of his best work in Wisconsin. But you'll also see things like the GT combos I like, where you're having guard, tackle, pulls, and counters, and that's where you get a lot of those unbalanced offensive lines and some of those odd alignments, and then of course the RPOs, right? This would be an offense that I would be excited to see Jordan Travis try to maneuver within, because he's going to bring some of that elite tier type athleticism to the offense. But also, as you've seen, Florida State has fallen off a cliff without him. So I still think there's a ton mentally that you can unlock with a guy like Jordan Travis, and hopefully you can work through some of the accuracy concerns and stuff like that, that he just needs the reps to kind of figure out. But he has a pretty solid day one supporting cast, if nothing else, rolling into 2025. So we'll see what pans out there. And again, it might not be him. You might be talking about this with a guy like Cam Ward, or a guy like Shedeur Sanders or somebody like that, depending on how the draft works out and what our plans are, either with Aaron Rodgers currently or, post Aaron Rodgers here. But I'm excited for him, right? You take a look at what's kind of been going on with the Commanders, because I do want to talk more so about the recency of Kliff Kingsbury's success, because this is a lot of what's propelling him to these head coach conversations, right? 24th in the red zone, 51.43%. This was maybe prior to the Giants game, I believe, when I saw these figures. So it's one of the biggest lowlights, right? Areas of opportunity for this Commanders offense. They're still a top scoring offense in the NFL. I believe they're top 3 still, which just means that they're able to hit the big plays. They're able to drive after drive after drive, go out there, and whether it's field goals, whether it's touchdowns, they're putting up points. This screams more so to me that there's some execution issues in the red zone, and for the Jets specifically, that's not something you necessarily want to have the next, guy running the show walk into as part of a weakness on their resume. Now, this is always up and down. It's very rare that you get offenses that consistently do very, very well in this area, but it is something to take away as a note and consider with him, right? And maybe they'll get it figured out. Again, there's a lot of nuance, a lot of also just newness within the offense, right? The head coach, the OC, Jaden Daniels being a rookie, Terry McLaurin trying to figure out how to vibe with them, Brian Johnson. Do you lean more on the run? Do you lean more on the pass? There's a lot of elements there that they're trying to figure out. But the good news, again, to offset that is that in general, they're scoring, right? 30 plus points a game for them isn't that much of a struggle, as opposed to the Jets. We get excited with Aaron Rodgers, 3 touchdowns in the second half, and that is a huge luxury for us. So one of the things I also do love is just some of the various points they've been able to capitalize on this season. The first team in the Super Bowl era to go to consecutive games without a turnover or a punt is absolutely insane. Think about the last time the Jets have gone through an entire game without needing to punt. I'll wait. But me specifically, I know my recall isn't as great as it used to be. I can't think of one off the top of my head where I can say this game was absolutely flawless from the standpoint of every time we've had the ball, we've been able to go out there and get something. In fact, what comes to my mind most likely is the Giants game, where it felt like everything was a punt until you got into the end of that fourth quarter. But I digress. Some of the other areas of concern are, and I've heard this has been much improved with the Commanders, but the player connection, and most specifically with the quarterback, I think is something where I saw an article talking about Kliff Kingsbury from the player standpoint was very standoffish, didn't really want to deal with confrontation and conflict whatsoever, and it left a lot of guys having to try to figure out things for their own, especially at a time where things aren't going well for the Cardinals, right? You talk about them starting to fall off that cliff, and they're having 4-12 finishes and such. And so not being able to go to your head coach, and he's, maybe I don't want to say unwilling, but the fact that he's unable to at least have that conversation, even if there isn't necessarily a solution, was a problem for me. Again, with the Commanders, it seems like that has changed, but a moment that defines his career to me so far is the fact that at one point during a national TV game, Kyler Murray yelled to his coach to calm the fuck down. And that's something you just can't have whatsoever. That's a clear violation of respect between the two. And so while, crazy things like that can happen and ultimately it becomes nothing, I think in Kliff Kingsbury's case is something to note and take away, that he may lose control of a locker room if things aren't going well for that team. Now, we'll see. A winning year, especially if you get deep in the playoffs and stuff, can change a lot of these narratives. But we'll see what happens. Now, one of the things I will say that he deserves praise for is the fact that Caleb Williams was essentially the undisputed number one choice. And with him being at USC, I think that's a, tip to a feather in his cap for Kliff Kingsbury. Even in a season where they didn't do well, I think USC lost 5 of its last 7 games or something crazy like that. But still, Caleb Williams did nothing to really tarnish that reputation. He gets a chance to work with Jaden Daniels, and now he has him looking light years ahead of the number one pick. And in fact, obviously he had that crazy Hail Mary touchdown to help him seal the win over the Bears when they matched up. But realistically, Jaden Daniels is being asked to do a ton, and you can take a look at the supporting cast between the two teams, the Bears and the Commanders, and walk away saying the Bears are definitively the better team. And yet Kliff Kingsbury has made magic work with Terry McLaurin, Brian Johnson, Austin Eckler, and really the names behind McLaurin aren't exciting whatsoever. And a lot of that is kind of due to some injury. A lot of that is just the fact that these guys are, probably practice squad guys in a lot of cases, or very aging veterans that you wouldn't really want to rely on as your second, third best wide receiver necessarily, especially if they haven't reached those top tier levels in the NFL in their playing career so far. 91% of their drives at some portion, for some segment of time this season, resulted in scoring plays. That's the nugget that I'll leave you guys on. Kliff has found a way to turn this into a version of the best show on turf, where every time Jaden Daniels is rolling out there, it feels like they're going to roll down the field, they're going to gas the defense, and they're going to find a way to manipulate and exploit guys that either aren't fully prepared, fully conditioned, and in a lot of these cases with that up-tempo offense, the defense can't even they can't even what's the word? Substitute. They can't call their substitutions. The defense doesn't have a ton of opportunities to communicate effectively on the back end because they honestly have no idea what's getting ready to come. So you have to play kind of predefined coverages and then hope you can recover on the back end as you guys are seeing stuff. So if you don't have a strong secondary, you're going to see the Commanders eat you up. And even if you do, they're going to be tested the entirety of the game. And so that's the piece that really excites me the most. Again, I don't know how you can marry a lot of these concepts with an aging guy like Aaron Rodgers, but he seems like he's going to find a way to have success. Even when you talk about the losing that he had at Texas Tech, the losing that he's had with the Cardinals, the offense in and of itself was still fairly effective in a lot of instances. So I think this is a guy that you can trust to find a way to figure things out on that side of the ball. Do I trust him much beyond that? At this point, not necessarily, but maybe some things from Dan Quinn and that roster he's put together with Anthony Lynn from the Chargers and etc. Can rub off on Kliff Kingsbury. So let me know what you guys think, though. Again, second former head coach that we're covering, so I know you guys love somebody that's not doing this for the first time. Let me know where he falls in your ranking so far out of the three guys that we covered between Kliff, Mike Vrabel, and Ben Johnson. And I'll catch you guys again. Peace.